I would like to introduce Ilyon Woo and moderator Courtney Marshall to the stage. Okay, great. Ilyon Woo is a New York Times bestselling author of Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, an epic journey from slavery to freedom, and The Great Divorce, a 19th century mother's extraordinary fight against her husband, the Shakers, and her times. Her writing has appeared in the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, Time, and the New York Times. And she has received support for her research from the Whiting Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Antiquarian Society, among other institutions. She holds a BA in the Humanities from Yale College and a PhD in English from Columbia University. Ilyon. And interviewing her today is the MVP of the Litfest. Courtney always pitches in for us here. Courtney Marshall. Yeah. Courtney has been at Phillips Exeter Academy for 8 years, where she teaches English and serves on the committee to study the legacy of slavery at the Academy. She is a lifelong student and teacher of African American literature and works with the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, drafting historical markers. As a volunteer with the New Hampshire Humanities Council, she facilitates book discussions at the Northern New Hampshire Correctional Facility in Berlin, and is currently researching the 1835 destruction of Noyes Academy in New Hampshire. There you go, ladies.
Wow. So, do we take this?
Yeah, maybe we.
Oh, great. Let me not break it. Be the least valuable player. So thank you all so much for coming today. We're going to hop right in with Ilyon. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you and hear what you have to say about your book. So I thought my first question was just, could you tell us who are William and Ellen Craft, and what drew you to writing their story?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you all for gathering here. I'm also so excited. We just connected via email and just started going back and forth already, and I'm very excited for all this conversation to come. William and Ellen Craft. So they are an incredible couple. They are a husband and wife who, in 1848, disguise themselves as master and slave, and not in any way that you might expect. So it's Ellen, who is the daughter of an enslaved woman named Maria, and her first enslaver, who, using the lightness of her complexion, disguises herself as the master, while William pretends to be her slave. So, I mean, we've heard a lot about the Underground Railroad in our national history in New Hampshire. There's no Underground Railroad here. There's no Underground Railroad that reaches this far into Georgia. So these two people are traveling in this disguise above ground on actual trains and steamboats and buses in plain sight over 4 days from Macon, Georgia to Philadelphia. It's an incredible journey with plot twists that you couldn't even, I mean, it's beyond fiction. And yet, that their arrival in Philadelphia is just the beginning.
Yeah, I love in the very beginning, you have the map. And right when they get above Portland, there's a part where it says they're on foot.
Yes.
As well. And that was just the last 7 miles on foot. And that is just absolutely amazing, amazing. And now I know you said there were some New Hampshire ties to this story. So I want to make sure we get a chance to also kind of talk about that as well.
Well, so I've been thinking a lot about Daniel Webster. Anyone familiar here with Daniel Webster, whose house is about like an hour north, right? I recently, every time I pass a state house in Boston, there's a big a sculpture of Dark Dan, as he was called back then, standing there kind of looking very grim-faced and somber and political-like. And then there are the tour buses that come by and say, here is our illustrious senator, Daniel Webster. Well, he plays a different role in this story. So as I mentioned, maybe I can give sort of the arc. How many people have read Master, Slave, Husband, Wife? Okay, so maybe like a third. So I will fill in, I will give the basic sort of 3-act arc so we can kind of follow this trajectory. There are no spoilers here because honestly, we know that they make it, right? The book would not be here. I would not be here if they did not make it. So it's not the what, it's the how that really keeps you at the edge of your seat. So in the first act, that's their escape from Macon, Georgia to Philadelphia. So that's the big famous first arc. And that's really what the Crafts write about in their own narrative, which was for me the starting point. I don't think I ever really answered that part of your question, which is how I first encountered the Crafts, and that was through this narrative that they wrote about a dozen years after their escape. But the story doesn't end there, right? Because when they get to Philadelphia, it's not like you cross a magical line into the north and you can celebrate and they're free. They are still in danger because by the terms of the United States Constitution, which Daniel Webster fights so hard to defend, by the terms of the Constitution itself, once the Crafts cross state lines, they owe their labor still to the enslavers across in Georgia. And so there is no protection for them. Their enslavers have the right at any point to go recapture them into bondage. You would think, and actually their original plan was to go straight to Canada. That would have been a point of safety. But they don't do that. When they get to this most dangerous place still in Philadelphia, an incredible man comes across their path. This is William Wells Brown. We can maybe talk about him a little bit later as well. But he's a self-emancipated author. He fills rooms like this, speaking out against slavery. This is really dangerous work. And he says, he knows a good story when he hears one. And he says to the Crafts, will you join me across the country to tell your story? They do. Right? So basically, they have markers on their back at this point when they make this decision. They become celebrities, and they're traveling across the country, and people know where they are because the news is following them. This news is going all the way back down to the South. So eventually, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, the enslavers actually send slave hunters after the Crafts. And that's when it becomes a national crisis, right? And this is the second act of the story. So the first act is the escape from the South. The second act becomes this escape from America. And that's where our Mr. Daniel Webster plays a role, because he is not only a key player in moving through the so-called Great Compromise, which includes an infamous Fugitive Slave Act that causes the Crafts enslavers to send the slave hunters after them, but he becomes the Secretary of State. And at that point, the Secretary of State's job is to oversee this kind of recapture. So he's in charge. This northern man is in charge. So as much as the Crafts were in danger in the South, they were even in greater danger in the North. And the person who was coming after them was my state, senator from my state, a representative of our country, Daniel Webster. So that's the long version of one connection to our state.
Wow. You think you know somebody, right?
But here's the thing about Daniel Webster. I mean, as I said, you look at his sculpture, and he looks like this very grim, serious man. When you look at, if you think about the Great Compromise that he and Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun they're associated with, Webster is the one who seems sort of northern and puritanical, but actually, he's never smiling at any of these pictures, but he was cracking jokes all the time. He was a notorious womanizer. He had his own private drinking room in the Capitol. I'll tell you a salacious little bit. He kept in his pocket, right? There's what's been called America's, any children here? I hope not. All right. America's first boob selfie. So there's this miniaturist painter named Sarah Goodrich, who he had this affair with, and she painted this exquisite portrait, self-portrait,
Boobies.
of, yeah. It's about this big. When I went to the Daniel Webster house in Marshfield, there were these two elderly, lovely lady docents who said, well, maybe we shouldn't tell you about this, but they said there had been an exhibition where this portrait was so arousing, provocative, that they actually had it inside something, and you had to actually peek inside to see this portrait. So why am I going to such lengths to talk about this portrait that he carried? Well, he was a man, We look at these figures and we sanctify them or we vilify them, but they were people with choices that they made, aside from this sort of sordid history. He had lost a child in the recent Mexican-American War. So when the crafts in 1850 are really on a collision course with history. The Mexican-American War has just ended. The borders of the nation are exploding. There's a transportation revolution, an information revolution. All this stuff is going on. We are on the brink of war. Right? And people like Daniel Webster, who have lost children, don't want to go to war again. And that's one of the reasons why he chooses to compromise. He's also got a lot of debts, and he's sort of in the pockets of so-called, basically Southern sympathetic Whigs. But there's a lot of complication there that guides people and the choices they make. And that's why one of the things I really try to do is sort of not just to show where people are coming, the choices that they're making, but where they're coming from and who they are as people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so when we were backstage, I was saying how much I appreciated the remarks about Frederick Douglass and how I've always seen Frederick Douglass as this sort of big, sort of muscular man, or he's this sort of elder statesman, looking in the photographs. And so to see that at some point he was having, I think you said, suggestions that he was on his way to a mental breakdown, but also physically. So actually to see the embodiment of someone like Douglass was very powerful for me. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about telling the story, because you're right, we do have these historical figures. I mean, you even have the Crafts who had already written their story. And so I'm really curious about when you come along, now, and you are writing in sort of a way that you're engaging with the story that's been told by the people, but there's also, as you said, there are these places where even when they wrote it, people didn't think it was true. But then you're also having to kind of grapple with these big historical figures, as well as there's a part, I'll just say, that I told her backstage I loved, this man named Moses.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could also just tell them about Moses so they can be moved as well. But you just have so many characters in this story. So how does all that come together?
Okay, there's a lot there. So if I lose track of Moses,
I asked a lot.
Please bring me back. Maybe I can talk first about just my story against the Crafts story, and then we'll pan out, and then we'll go back in and see Moses. But the Crafts story is incredible, and I urge you all to read it. It's short. It's a 60-page narrative. I have a direct link to it from my website. It's digitally available. You can also buy it, but it's it's an adventure story. It's a love story. It's a story that's told in William Craft's voice. So that's one of the things that actually kind of happens in this, that Ellen's voice over time it gets sort of covered up. And so you have this voice of William Craft telling this incredible story, but as I said earlier, the things, the huge things that it leaves out. So how I conceived of this, maybe I could share the metaphor here, is if you have these two melodies that are the Crafts' voices, right, William and Ellen, I want to amplify those voices, right? So they are the soloists, and how I really conceived of my role is to be kind of an orchestra conductor and creating a score, like a musical score that goes on underneath their voices, shows all the background, and enables their melodies to really shine. But I'm also going to cue up Douglas. He's got an aria because he comes and he stands for them and he sings with them. I'm going to cue up Daniel Webster because he's speaking about the compromise, and that's going to be a direct collision path with theirs. And they're going to be smaller voices. Some of them you don't even hear. Maybe you might see. And the example of that would be Moses. So the Crafts in their narrative, so many things go wrong for them in this adventure, which, it's one of the things that's astonishing is how they're able to pivot constantly. But one of the things is their original journey was just supposed to be from Macon to Savannah by train, Savannah to Charleston by boat, and then one more boat to Philadelphia. So boom, 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 3 steps. They get to Charleston and they learn that Philadelphia-bound ship is not running. It's not running due to the seasons, but there had also been a failed escape, right? Like the last ship to have made that course had carried a fugitive who was caught on board. I was wondering if there's any possible way to know if that person, can we find that person? So I started looking in the newspapers. Can we make visible this person with a failed escape? And there was a man named Moses. So this man named Moses had belonged to a woman named Miss Mary Brown. So she was an enslaver in Charleston. He had himself put inside a box, and he had the box shipped to Philadelphia. He might have made it. He was on the ship. It was ready to go. The problem was that the weather interfered. The ship got detained for an extra day and a half. So this poor man is stuck in this box. He eventually has to leave the box. There happened to be, and the tone of the article that describes it is actually light, and it talks about how there was another box with pomegranates and wine that was meant as a gift for newlyweds. So he's eating the pomegranates and wine, and he's stuck in these quarters, and eventually he is captured, and we don't know what happens to him. So, later on, the Crafts, not too much later than this, the Crafts will be on a stage in Faneuil Hall with thousands of people, right? Douglas will be there. Henry Box Brown will be there. This is a man who's celebrated and known now for having himself mailed from Richmond, Virginia, in a box to Philadelphia. So there's, massive amounts of applause there. But when I saw Henry Box Brown on the stage, all I could think of was Moses. And going back to Douglas, one of the reasons why Douglas actually, he didn't think that Henry Box Brown and William and Ellen Craft should have told their stories. Because what happens when you tell this story is that people become alerted, right? Yes. And all those people who might have made that escape, they're in greater danger. And that's exactly what happens. That same time when they're congregated in Boston, there is another failed box attempt. So somebody tries to mail themselves, actually 2 men try to have themselves mailed from Richmond to Philadelphia, just like Henry Box Brown did. And who opens that box in the end but the mayor of Richmond? So there's a Henry Box Brown that makes it. There's Moses that fails. There's these 2 men that failed. And there's one more box I want to bring your attention to, which is a little girl named Isabel White, who was about 5 years old. Somebody put her in a box labeled sweet potatoes and had her mailed up to the north. Somebody else opened that box in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and found this child. That's another box. So for every box that we have, every craft story that we have, as much as those deserve celebration, I also wanted to be mindful of all those who didn't make it.
That's, wow. Wow, I'm trying to keep it together. That's beautiful. I'm so, and I know we're going to open it up to questions and comments, and I'm so grateful for your writing, and I always like to say that I'm grateful for your writing, grateful for the archivists and the docents and everyone who helped you with this. And I also want to, and you can maybe show this.
Yes.
Before we turn it over. And you can just tell them kind of what this is. And y'all think of y'all questions while y'all sitting there.
Yeah, so these are the end papers. I wanted the first thing for people to see when they opened the book was this multiracial army of people who stood with, either actually or symbolically, with the crafts. Most of these people actually knew the crafts. There are only a couple that who were sort of inspirations for the crafts, but these are all fellow activists. And I think in stories like this, it's too easy just to focus on the heroes as an exception, but they belong in a world and in a community. And there's so few degrees of separation between people in that era and actually ours. And I wanted that to come through. I wanted, again, this feeling of a chorus. I wanted to feel operatic. And I wanted that feeling of the crafts being held aloft by their own powers, but also by others who are supporting them and who make the choice to support them. I actually had an interview where I kind of realized where this storyboard sort of came from for me, because I had been talking to this interviewer, this journalist, about my own childhood education. And I was really lucky. I didn't realize how unconventional an education that I got, but I went to an elementary school named after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the history that was taught to me wasn't like with textbooks. We had speeches, we had stories, we had songs, we had images. The teachers would paper the walls with images. And my first research paper, I think it was like in 4th grade, it was on Benjamin Banneker. And I got to choose Benjamin Banneker as the person I wanted to write about. And I remember choosing his image from a whole bunch of images on the wall. So this reporter had noticed that I had pictures of Eleanor William Craft on my desk, which I do. But if you turn around, actually, there are pictures, I have corkboards with all these different pictures of people, both people who stood with the crafts and also people like Daniel Webster who stood against them. And she was looking at these pictures and looking at the endnotes, and she said, "These are just like the picture walls that you described from your childhood." And I was like, oh my gosh, that's totally it. These are the picture walls. And I guess it shows to me like the way we learn history, what we learn in childhood, it really does stick. And I think my way of conceiving this book as this kind of anthem with all these different choral voices, it comes from back then.
Wow. Thank you. Oh, goodness gracious. Yeah, go Slim. Thank you so much for that wrap up. Beautiful. So,
I'll run the mic if people have questions.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing book. It is, and for bringing the craft story to life. It's incredible. And not only is it a symphony, but you also weave in the politics of the time and the Fugitive Slave Act. And I wanted to ask you a question about Ellen's point of view, because she is the one that really takes the biggest risk in the escape. And it seems like her voice isn't heard. once they become well-known? And can you share a little bit about insights into her?
Sure, thank you. Ellen fascinated me from the beginning, and her voice is one that I most deeply wanted to help recover. And you're right, when they're first actually in front of these crowds, and they're in Faneuil Hall, and all these spaces, and thousands of people are gathering to hear them, in the beginning, she is actually an active participant in the speaking. So she's doing the Q&As. She actually, at one point in Newburyport, Massachusetts, she does tell the story. But actually, it's right after that that she goes silent. And people have different interpretations. Scholars have suggested, for example, that William, her husband, and William Wells Brown, the dynamic speaker, activist who takes them on the road, these guys they would love to have a microphone. They were great storytellers, and they just, when they end up in Edinburgh at one point, and it's like a whole bromance adventure. They are lighting up rooms, they're having a grand time. Ellen didn't seem to want that kind of attention. And my personal feeling, based on everything that I've read and all the eavesdropping I did in the archives, really following other people as they were watching her, because if Ellen herself didn't speak a lot, everyone had their eyes on her, and they were observing what she was saying. They were recording these things. She was not a retiring, shy person, right? So in the book and in various accounts, Ellen is described as shrinking, and as William will say, she really only did this because I insisted. This is the last thing that she wanted to do. They kind of had to say that, because how shocking is it for a woman this era to don a man's clothes and then to be up on a public stage talking about it, right? So they had to tell that story. But beneath that, you see a different Ellen, and that's really what I tried to bring out. And I tried to bring out her silence also, not as a passive act, but as an incredibly smart act of resistance. And the last thing I would just add to that is, again, you just have to think about the fact that she and William have spent a lifetime in bondage. They've had this harrowing journey. They're on the road for months on end. And people are asking them all kinds of questions, and they're really probing trauma. It's also very possible that she just didn't want to speak anymore. And who says she has to tell her story? I recently found in the archives, because history is still like, I'm still open to finding new sources of information, and they're in this kind of crowded space, and they are getting this Q&A where they're constantly emphasizing the fact that what they experienced in slavery was, relatively speaking, not so bad. So they keep saying that, like, as bad as what we experienced was, it's nothing compared to what most people experienced. And I go further into that and their position in the book. But so somebody asks them from the audience, if it wasn't so bad, then why did you run away? So this is the kind of question they're getting, right? And they have to answer night after night. Why would you run away? So William, you know what he says? I love this. He says, my place is vacant. You may have it if you wish.
I know that's right. I know that is right.
Another question? Sorry, I'm gonna let the person who's closest to me go.
Funny.
Go ahead.
Can you? Oh, yes. Okay. I love how you spoke about writing this as an orchestra, right? That's a beautiful analogy. And I'm curious, emotionally and psychologically, how it was for you when you were weaving in those more challenging pieces of the narrative, when you did have to do all this research into the heartbreaking pieces of the story.
Thank you. The archives are devastating. They really are. And I think one thing that I really led with is the trauma that the both crafts experienced as children. I don't think I can do them justice right now. I've tried to do them justice in the book, but Ellen was given away, as a wedding present when she was 11, and William also saw his family members sold off one by one, and narrates very powerfully in the 1860 narrative how his last moments of seeing his sister. So they're on an auction block, essentially a stage, and she is sold first, and then he he really begs to be able to go after, just to say goodbye to his sister one last time. And he's denied that last goodbye, and he never sees her again. And you can feel the presence of that pain in the narrative and the story they write. So I did a lot of excavation trying to figure out like what were the background circumstances of that. I saw evidence of their actual tears, whether it's William and his brother going to their previous enslaver's family and trying to connect about their family, whether it's on the stage at Faneuil Hall when they are hearing their friend William Wells Brown, who is this incredible showman and has people laughing and all kinds of things, but in the next moment, he's talking about his own family losses, which are so palpable to the Crafts, and they're crying in this moment. This is not something that the abolitionist papers are talking about, but there's actually a Boston Post reporter who is noticing this, and I thank him, as antagonistic as he was, for sharing that bit of detail. There's a lot of trauma that they experienced, and as for me, I guess I've just tried to be a witness, and when you see. One of the things that was really striking, actually, is finding the advertise. So we know that William and his sister were auctioned. I found, actually, the listing for them for sale. I found the mortgage by which he and his sister were eventually commodified in this way. I found the advertisement for their sale. But their advertisement actually says 3 Negroes. There's no name. I know that it was them because of the mortgage, because of the date, because of the enslaver. So whenever you see something like 3 Negroes, or if you see the word slave, or if you see names, for each one of those people, there's somebody with a book, a life. And that's the thing that I really tried to keep sort of front and center in my mind with every name I saw, or every noun.
On behalf of all of us, thank you very much for writing this book and bringing this story back to light. As parts of it were known, but parts of it were part of your scholarship. I have a question in particular about a minor character. And the question is more, how did you do the research on this fellow? He's a particularly odious clerk. I believe it's in Charleston, is it? Where he's the customs clerk. And it's his job to make sure that inappropriate commodities don't leave the state.
Yeah.
And just the horror of the whole situation. And this zealous, almost, junkyard dog of a clerk who's eventually put off by someone who knows who this couple is tangentially and may have actually played a role in helping them escape. But that's not the character I'm interested in. It's the clerk. Do you have any story to tell about that, or is that just a...
So that is thank you for your question. And there are these heart-stopping moments where, the Crafts couldn't catch a break. Like, really, on this journey, every moment you're like, okay, something happens again. It's like one of those horror movies where, like, there's something, it jumps out at jump scares at, like, every possible turn. And nothing works twice. The same strategy will never work twice, but they're also learning. And they're improving their performance with each iteration. So in this particular case in Charleston, again, they've just learned that the ship that was supposed to take them directly to Philadelphia is not running. They have to stay at a hotel. I found evidence, and this was one of the big breakthroughs of the book, that actually Ellen knew this town. So they know what the horrors are that lay in the inappropriately named Sugar House in Charleston, which is not far by. She knows this whole landscape. So they've got so much at stake in this moment when Ellen has to sign for her slave. The interaction with the clerk is a moment that the Crafts actually describe. in their narrative. So thank goodness that we have that story, and we have the dialogue from that moment. But what I tried to do was build around that moment. So one thing that the crafts don't tell us, but that I had other camera people on the ground, I was reading all these other accounts and figuring out the geography of the place, the layout of everything. What they don't tell us at this custom house where they have this standoff is right next door from where this is happening, right outside the window and visible, is Charleston's largest outdoor slave market. So there's a marker for that now, but that is visible. So it's like, it stands for all the trauma that they have experienced, everything they may experience, everything they're hoping to avoid is right there. So the clerk, I was able to follow the craft's path, but there are other things around that I really tried to build into the scene that people from that era might have known that that was visible, but we don't. So I considered my job as one to try to make visible and turn that camera around.
I think we can do one more question. We have one more, preferably someone who's near me. Here.
Thank you. I'm wondering what you want your readers to take away today as we confront our own revolutions, the technological, the cultural, political. We have some heroes, we have many supportive characters. We all make choices and so forth. What is it from the book that you're hoping we might glean that we can take away into our own lives today?
Thank you for that question. What a great one to close with. I hope we can move away from the story with a new definition of what it means to be an American hero. The crafts are motivated by the Declaration of Independence, by lines from the Bible. They are constantly challenging themselves, each other, their community, their nation, at every possible turn. So not only even making that escape from slavery, but in standing up against this terrible law, in speaking out and bearing witness. And then after the Civil War, coming back and building schools and educating people, even after they're burnt out by white supremacists. They are pushing to the very end of their days. And I hope that's an example that we can take with us. I mean, right now we are living in really divided times. There are books that are being banned. You know, there's all this controversy over what stories need to be taught, what stories deserve to be taught. I guess my hope is that we can look to new heroes like the crafts for inspiration, and as we look backwards and acknowledge that past, be able to change our future.
Thank you.